Thank you. Yeah. My friend. All right. So I have a feeling any minute my cell phone's going to go off. It's going to be really loud. Hi. Hola. Yeah, it's very bright up here, but I see you. So here's what I am going to do today up here. So back in 1997, some of you were born, I started volunteering in hospice. And back at that time in the US, people weren't really, at least in my circles, but I think generally, people weren't in this conversation around death and dying. And I was minding my own business. I was working in a career in book publishing, which I loved. It was a great place to be. It was a great thing to do with my life. And I kind of stumbled into this hospice work. And as a volunteer, I have no clinical background. I was not educated as a nurse, not educated as a physician, but I started doing this work. And so today in my talk, really what I want to do is share with you my experience of volunteering and the way this has changed my life, the way this has transformed my life. And so the way I want to tell this story is through my relationships with people. So hospice is about relationships, period, full stop. It's about relationships, it's about community, it's about deep human connection. So this is the only way I can tell my story. So this woman here, this older woman, this is my Bubby Sylvia. This is my maternal grandmother. We called her Bubby Sylvia. And as a young boy, as a child, I had a very close relationship with Bubby Sylvia. And so this is a shot of, I'm in the background there on the left-hand side, and this is my family. My younger brother, my sister, and some cousins of mine, her grandchildren. And so when I got older, and I was at the time living in Chicago, my Bubby Sylvia got very sick, and her relationship with my mother was very difficult. So my mother came to me and she said, "Will you go be with your grandmother?" And I knew nothing about hospice. I knew nothing about end-of-life care. As a kid, I spent a little bit of time in the hospital, and I didn't like hospitals at all. They made me very anxious and nervous. But I went to be with my grandmother, my Bubby Sylvia. And at the time, because I knew nothing about hospice, when she told me that she was ready to die, that she had lived a good life, she had lived a happy life, she had her struggles, but she was finished. There was nothing I could do. I did not know how to advocate for her because all I knew was hospitals, right? Or being at home at the end of life. This is all I knew. So when my Bubby Sylvia died, my life went on, and I was dealing with my grief experience. And I began working for a very small Buddhist publisher. And there were two people there, Patrick and Maria. And they had this way of allowing me to talk about this death and this loss. And they were wonderful. And I needed that. I needed for someone to listen. And then one day they said, we volunteer at this hospice. It's like, oh, what is that? And it was Zen Hospice Project. And I had studied Zen as a student. I was very interested in it, but I didn't know anything about hospice. So I learned about this place, and I decided to pursue this. So this is one of the training classes at Zen Hospice Project. And the training was a lot. It was very intense. I filled out, it was about a 10-page application. And we say that the application is the first part of the training. It really required that I think very carefully, very deeply about my relationship to death and to loss. And then I went for an interview, and the interview was incredible. It took me to a place I had never gone before. Now, I'm someone who is very easy, it's very easy for me to cry. I've always been this way. And in this interview, I just loved the way that this man, he could meet me in this place of intense grief as I explored my story about my relationship to death and dying and my losses. And after the interview, I started the training. And the training was about 45 hours over 2 weekends and 2 weekday evenings. And much of the training is about, exploring our relationship to loss, and then, about a third of it is about, how to serve in a healthcare environment. But it was a very illuminating and a very challenging training. There were about 20 of us in the training. Okay. So some of you saw this beautiful home when we showed Endgame the other night. And this is the Zen Hospice Project guest house facility. So this is the first place I volunteered after the training. We have 2 sites of service, 2 places where our volunteers serve. And the guest house, and then Laguna Honda Hospital, which is the big public hospital in San Francisco for, we say, the underserved. Many people have been living on the streets, they go to Laguna Honda. But this is where I started. And, I'll never forget that very first shift of mine, beginning as a volunteer. I had this wonderful training with this group, this community of other volunteers who were just starting, and we were joining an existing community of volunteers. But when I showed up at this place for my evening shift, I was very nervous. I didn't know what to expect. I didn't know how to actually sit with these people who were living until their last breath, okay? So we started off that evening with a shift change meeting. So the way we do this for our volunteers is that volunteer shifts are 5 hours long, and they overlap by 1 hour. And during that hour, we sat meditation. We each were able to check in on how we were doing in that moment. So what was I bringing in with me as I start my shift? And then we exchanged practical information about the patients, or as we call them, the residents, who were living in the house. And then I began my shift. And the volunteers who were there in the afternoon, they went home. So this is the grand stairway in the guest house. So all the residents they have their rooms on the second floor, and on the bottom floor is the kitchen and what we call the great room, and the dining room, and access to the back area. But this stairway holds great importance for me because it was kind of a portal. It was a passage through which I had to move to leave behind what I had experienced during the day, to go up and sit with the volunteers, sit with the residents, to be present with them. And so I remember that first shift, going up those stairs and not knowing what I would find. And when I got up there that first time, I knew that I would have to knock on one of these doors and go in. And what would this be like for me, right? I didn't know what to do. I had no idea. But I was there. I knew I had to do something. So the first resident I ever sat with was Raj. And Raj was this man from India. And when I met Raj, he was still able to get out of his bed and walk over to the chair, but he didn't leave his room much. And I walked in, and I was very nervous, and I wanted to do this perfectly, because then that's what I thought I needed to do, was to do it perfectly, to be with him. And so when I walked in, he could see this. He could see in me my doubt and my anxiety. And something really incredible happened. He invited me to sit down, and you know where this is going. He invited me to sit down, and he said, "How are you today?" And, you know, I probably told him, "Oh, I'm fine." And he said, "Okay." But what happened was Raj began to take care of me. And I learned something really valuable with Raj on that first shift that I carry with me to this day. And that is, even people who are at the very end of their life, we have to allow them to take care of others. So we have to allow them to take care of us. This is an essential human need, to take care of others. So it wasn't for me to deny this of Raj. And I'm so grateful to him. So weeks later, months later, that first year, I showed up for my shift, and I went up those stairs. Maybe some of you have heard this story. And at the top of the stairs was the director at the time, Frank, this big, tall man. And he was standing over me as I was coming up the stairs. And he said, "Roy, come here." He said, "This young man died today." He was maybe in his 30s. I think he was older than me at the time, but younger than me now. And he said, "I want you to go sit with him, and I want you to imagine yourself in that bed." So I trusted Frank. I followed all his directions. So I went in, and I sat with this man at the bedside. And as best as I could, I tried. I tried to imagine myself in that bed like this. And sometimes it takes me a while to understand these things, but in that moment, what I realized, I didn't know this when I first started, when I first applied, but what I learned in that moment was, yes, I'm here to serve others, but this is about my death. That's what this is about. This is about me beginning to understand that my time will come, and what am I going to do about that? What's that going to mean for me? So I'll share another story with you, another lesson that I learned. So I remember showing up at the guest house one evening, and back then, we did not have any kitchen staff. We did not have any volunteers in the kitchen. The volunteer caregivers would go upstairs, find out what the residents would like to eat. We'd go down to the kitchen and we would prepare it. So I went up and I checked in with this resident. And she said, "I'd like a grilled cheese sandwich." Do you eat this here in Brazil, grilled cheese? Well, as a kid, I hated grilled cheese. Did not like it at all. So I never really learned how to make it. It's a very simple thing to make, but I never made it. So I went down to the kitchen, and as best as I could, I made her some grilled cheese. So I took it back up, and I walked in the room, and I gave it to her, and she took a bite, and she threw me out of her room. She said, "Get out of here. You can't even make grilled cheese." And I was very hurt by that. I failed, you know. I'm a lousy volunteer. Like, why am I here? This poor woman, she's dying, and I can't even give her grilled cheese. But even though I avoided her room the next week and maybe the week after, what I began to realize was it's not about the grilled cheese, right? It wasn't about me. She was losing so much control in her life, you know. She couldn't make her own grilled cheese. She had to ask someone else to do it. So what is that like? What does that feel like? You know, to lose this control day after day, something else is lost. So of course, in this moment, she was angry, and I happened to be standing there. So I learned not to take anything personally. It's not about me. It's about the connection, and it's about holding space for her to express what she needs to express in these difficult circumstances. This is Pamela, and I love this photo. So I served for 6 years at the guest house, and then the guest house closed for renovations, and then I went over to Laguna Honda, to the hospice ward there, to be a Zen Hospice Project volunteer at this different site. And we cared for many very, very difficult people. Pamela's story is very common for Laguna Honda. She lived on the streets. She had a history of drug abuse. She had a horrible childhood. Every now and then she would talk about her childhood, but it was very uncomfortable for her. And she took a liking to me. And she asked a lot of me. She demanded a lot of me. She wanted my time, and she was very into exchanging things. So she would give me something, but she wanted something in return. You know, she would somehow find an object, and she'd give it to me, and she'd want something in return. And she was always hitting me up for money. And every time, Pamela, no, I'm not going to give you money. So I remember one day, I was coming off the elevator, and I heard Pamela's voice. I was coming off the elevator and going to our shift change meeting, and she saw me, and she started calling out for me. She could still get around. She had her walker, and she had what we call COPD, so she couldn't get enough air, and she couldn't get enough of anything. She just needed more. And she called out to me, and I was late for this meeting, and I didn't want to be late for this meeting. And I thought to myself, you know, I think I can go this way and pretend I don't see her, and then I'll talk to her later. But then in that moment, I thought, no, that's not the person I want to be. I went to her, and I looked at her, and I said, Pamela, I'm on the way to a meeting. I cannot talk to you now, but I will come back. And in this difficult relationship with Pamela, I realized, you know, I have to maintain these clear boundaries. That's a really important part. So people understand that I want to be engaged, I want to be in a relationship, but sometimes I can only do this much. This became very important. So I remember hospice it's about love too. It's about love. I have a colleague, and he says, it's about the love, baby. And it really is. It's just, you know, opening our hearts to people. And I remember the first time I fell deeply in love with a resident. And this was at the guest house. And I would go and I would sit in her room, and I would talk to her just about, you know, regular things. But there was one shift where I was spending time with Mira, was her name. And I was sitting in a chair next to her bed, and we were talking and talking, and then we arrived at this place where there was really nothing left to be said. We had slowly arrived at this place. Some of you know this experience, maybe all of you, where our tastes, our preferences, our opinions, our style, our favorite sports team, everything just fell away. And what was left there was just this essential connection, this heart connection between the two of us. And I moved to the edge of her bed, and she leaned into me, and I held her, and I could feel, she was so thin at that time, her body was nothing but skin and bones. And I held her, and it was this mystical experience of these two people coming together in this moment in time and just sharing our humanness together. And it was pure love. It was pure love. It was a moment. And then the next week, I came back, and there was nothing. I went up to Mira's room. She was there. And she looked at me, and it was like it was gone. She didn't remember me. She didn't remember that encounter. And I realized this is what it's like in hospice. Things change so quickly. Like if I'm attached to hanging on to that experience that we had, it's just more suffering. That's all it is. It's just more suffering. So it was painful for a minute, but then I realized that was that experience, this is this experience. Just be here now. Meet her where she's at in this moment. Don't hang on to that. That's not what this is about. I learned how to bathe the residents' bodies after they died. This is a beautiful ritual that we do at Zen Hospice Project. And this is such an important piece for the families. So I learned how to bathe the bodies myself, but maybe more importantly, to facilitate this ritual and to pull the family members in, the ones who come right to the bedside and the ones who hang back. How to make them part of this. Some of these families they'll laugh and they'll sing songs and they'll tell stories, and others will just weep, as we say, anointing the body, just gently. And I began to just deeply appreciate these simple acts of honoring these residents as they cross over, as they move through this portal from life to death, and these acts of kindness towards the families. I love this painting. So something was happening to me. As Tom mentioned, I do this rites of passage work out in the deserts of California. And in my experience as a hospice volunteer, I was in this passage. I was in this rite of passage, this initiation process. So something in me was really dying to make room for something so incredible to be born, to take life. And it could only happen by placing myself at that edge of such intense suffering. Yeah. So the suffering is kind of that, it's that chrysalis of change. It's where that change happens. So I was learning how to do this work. I was preparing for something bigger and more meaningful. I was learning how to really appreciate every moment of my life, whether I was at hospice or not, and how to live it with gratitude. I felt like I was the ferryman and I was the passenger, both together, as we were crossing over to this new place. I love this quote. It's from the great Indian poet Tagore. I slept and dreamt that life was joy. I woke and saw that life was service. I acted, and behold, joy was service. So I was being held in this community. I was being held by this practice of mindfulness, inspired by the Zen tradition, but this practice of mindfulness that exists in every spiritual tradition from around the world. This ability to just be in the moment with things as they are. And I was learning that there's a difference between service and there's a difference between service and helping. And helping is I have something to give to this person because they don't have it. But service is about meeting each other as equals, right? Yeah. So joy was service. And my heart was opening. My heart was blossoming. So I decided that I needed to make some changes in my life. So I told you I started off, I was working in the publishing industry, but I realized there was another calling for me. So I began to navigate this journey from the publishing work, which served its purpose, to finding a way to work in end-of-life care. Yeah, this is what was happening. So in 2010, I was able to make the leap. I jumped, and it was very difficult. My wife was very nervous because Zen Hospice Project is what we call a nonprofit. So my salary went from here to here, and there was just a lot of uncertainty, but it had to be done, My soul was telling me that there's no other choice. I have to do this. I couldn't live with myself if I didn't. So these are some of the staff and volunteers at the guest house. And what was so beautiful about this place, and I think it is still true, is that whether we're staff or volunteers, we treat each other with such care and kindness. And there's this understanding that we're not so different from the ones in the beds. Our time is coming soon. So we can treat each other as though our days are numbered and very short. And this makes a huge difference. It's an incredible working culture there. So this woman on your left, on the end here, this is my dear friend Travis. And Travis showed up one day at the front door of the guest house, and we introduced ourselves to each other, and we discovered we had all these friends in common we didn't know about. And she decided to come and volunteer with us. And Travis died last year. And what I noticed about her death was that she gave herself over to it. There was incredible acceptance and even surrender to her experience. And she was such a teacher in those final months of her life. It was extraordinary. And sitting with her was just beautiful. It was a joy. It was a joy to sit with her at the very end of her life. The way she just met each moment that showed up for her. I miss her a lot. So in my work in, yeah, so I've been blessed. I've been blessed with many mentors in this work. And so hospice is about connection. Hospice is about love. Hospice is about mentoring, right? Like making it comfortable for people to sit in that place. And so we've got Ram Dass and then Frank Ostaseski. And I've had the opportunity to talk with Ram Dass, but my mentor in this work has been Frank. And if you don't know Frank Ostaseski, I think his book's been published into Portuguese and is here now. Yeah, I highly recommend it. In English, we say the 5 invitations. And he's a beautiful man. And he's struggling too right now with his own health issues. So I pray that he's well. This man on the left is Eric Pochet, and Eric's the one who interviewed me that I mentioned before. And here Eric is standing with a dear friend of mine. I call her my sister. This is Mary, and she's been a volunteer for a long time, and Tom has met Mary. But Eric is another mentor. I think I've probably learned more about this work from this man than anyone else, maybe with the exception of the residents themselves. But he's just big-hearted, gentle soul, and he's really quite skillful in this work. This is Joan, and Joan is our longest-serving volunteer. And I served on the board of directors with Joan I was a director for 6 years. Joan and I overlapped by 4. But she's incredible. To see her with the residents and the staff, just such courage and skill and authenticity. Yeah. Joan is one of those people where what you see is what you get. Like, this is me, and take it or leave it. But she's lovely. This is my dear friend now, I'm so happy to say. I met Irene in 1997 when she came in to present at our training. She did a session on, she calls it touch awareness, but healing touch, like how we touch each other, you know? And so for many years, she was just Irene, bigger than life. And more recently, since I've joined the staff, she and I have become friends. And she is this beautiful, as you can see, but wise and big-hearted elder. Yeah, she was one of these people who, back in the 80s, when Zen Hospice Project first started, during the AIDS crisis, she would go into San Francisco General Hospital, which was really the hospital acute care setting for the poor in San Francisco. And she would go and she would be with these men who were living with this mysterious disease that nobody knew what it was. And without gloves or anything, she was touching them and healing them with her touch when no one else would get near them. She's remarkable. I'm so grateful to Irene. So I began to learn to just give away whatever I have. Whatever I have to offer, I'm going to give it away. Again, it's not about me. It's about whatever I can offer. So I started to find my voice in this work. You know, Eric had invited me to begin facilitating the trainings in, I think it was 2001. And the fact that I'm standing up here today and talking to you, and that it doesn't feel like a weird form of torture is absolutely incredible, because I'm really an introvert. But slowly, with this perspective that whatever I've learned I have to give away, allowed me to begin to, teach this work, to talk about it, and to hold space for people who are grieving. And I love it. I love doing this work. I feel so honored. And then, yes. So my mom and my dad. Yeah, so this is Phyllis and Bernard. So then in 2016, my father called me. I live very far from my parents. If you know the US, I'm in San Francisco and they were in Detroit. And my dad called and he said, I could tell he was very frightened. I could hear it in his voice. My mom had been chronically ill for a long time. And he said, your mom is slurring her speech. I can't understand her. And I said, well, put her on the phone. So he put my mom on the phone and we tried to talk to each other, but I couldn't really understand her. And I stayed calm and I told her I loved her. That was my last conversation with her. And I talked to my dad again. I said, Dad, I think what you need to do is call 911. You need to get her to the hospital. And my dad, who couldn't quite see her in her current situation because he had been along for the progression, you know. But I think he was frightened of the idea of her going to the emergency room because he knew. So a couple hours later, I called back. I said, Dad, what'd you do? He was like, I'm still waiting. I was like, no, you got to get her to the emergency room. So he did. And so the next time I saw my mom, you know, this is what I heard. And my mom was in that ICU bed. So there she was. She was in the ICU. She was intubated, and she was on a breathing machine, and all the monitors. And it was horrible to see her like that in this place. So I want to say something about ICUs. You know, I had this bias that the worst possible death was in the ICU. I couldn't imagine it for myself. I couldn't imagine it for anyone else. And my mom never wanted to talk about death and dying. I would go home with the 5 wishes and be like, let's talk about what you want. And she was like, I can't do it. She'd start crying, I can't do it. She was very emotional. So she ended up in the ICU. And in some ways, it made perfect sense. And I could see what was happening. So I talked to the director of the ICU department, and he told me about the evaluation, and I could see where this was going. But my father couldn't see it, and my sister, who was there at the time, couldn't see it. They had this expectation that this was one more time where she was going to get better and she was going to go back home. But that wasn't happening. So, the honor and the horror was bestowed upon me to have to tell my father and my sister that the most compassionate thing to do for my mom would be to take her off the life support and allow natural death. There was really no other choice right now. It wasn't fair to her to leave her in this state. And they began to see it, you know. So ironically, what happened for us was I think it was on a Monday, and so we decided on Wednesday at a particular time we would take her off life support, and all the family would have time to come in. My brother and his family came in, my sister's children came in, my wife came in. And so when we took my mom off life support, she was surrounded by her family. And the staff in the ICU, the palliative care team, they were beautiful. They were so supportive. And it didn't take her long to die. I think maybe 10 minutes had passed, and she stopped breathing. But what had seemed like the worst possible place to die became a beautiful place to die. This was my mother's death, and we were all there. And this is just the way it was. Yeah. So I remember I took this photo just a couple minutes after my mom died, and at the time, I was in this sort of confusing place. There was some shame around taking this photo, but there was this voice that told me, no, take the photo. You should take the photo. And I'm happy I did. Yeah. This is Mom after she died. So, one thing I've learned in all these years of doing this work is to give myself over to grief, to allow myself to meet it fully, to not resist, to not turn away, but to be in it. And that's what I did, after my mom died. And I allowed for my own shifts and process to take place. I remember writing to my community back at home a letter telling them, an email, what was going on with me. And I shared with them part of the eulogy that I gave at my mother's funeral. And in the eulogy, I shared that this work has prepared me for this moment. And this work has not prepared me at all for this moment. And how could it, right? This was my mother. It was really different. But I was extremely grateful that I could at least play this role that was supportive for my family. Like, this was not unfamiliar territory for me. So that I really, really appreciated. So I'm no different from any of you. I was, this man doing his life, and I stumbled into this work, and it has been this incredible transformation. And I'm so grateful that I fell into it, that I found it. And as I've said over and over again, you heard the other day, such close proximity to death just allows me to just recognize the preciousness in each moment and live a really happy life. So now it's my time to mentor others and to give away what I have. And a lot has changed at Zen Hospice Project. This beautiful guest house is no longer ours. We closed the facility, and we actually had to sell this house. And right when that happened, I stepped into this role of executive director. And I remember going through that and saying to the community there was so much grief around the loss of this house. And I remember saying, we don't get to choose, Everything goes eventually, even our beloved house. And I just keep reminding myself that even as the executive director of the organization now, it's still about service. It's still about giving it away and supporting others. So I love this quote from the Dalai Lama. My religion is very simple. My religion is kindness. And that kind of brings it down to its essence. This is the final slide. There's nothing on this slide. And that's because this is your slide. Yeah. This slide, can we go back? Yeah, this slide is for you. I came here last year and this year, and the Brazilians have been so beautiful and so welcoming and have opened their hearts and their arms to me. It's been so incredible. So I know what the potential is here, you know? Maybe it's a beautiful guest house facility here in Sao Paulo. Maybe it's a robust, big, large community of hospice volunteers. Maybe it's palliative care at every hospital in Brazil. I don't know, but the potential is there. So this is your slide to figure that out. And the last thing I'll say is, God, these lights, they're so bright. Thank you. Yeah, thank you for being here, and thank you for listening. And it's just a delight for me to do my little small piece to help you do this. So, obrigado.